Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our concert, and actually our pre-concert talk. I am delighted to tell you that I am not just doing this alone today, although you don't see my partner in crime, but you know him from other conversations. Lori Schulman, who is usually here, she is in Virginia at the moment, and so I'm very proud to have done the preparation and to do this talk with our very good friend, Dr. Till Meyn. Please help me welcome him. For those of you who are new, Till is the composition professor at TCU, and I've been privileged to actually play some of his music, and I can tell you that it's one of the very great living composers. So we're very privileged to have you here. Delighted to explain a little bit of this very lengthy and heavy, some people say depressing program that I've sculpted, so I have no one to look to blame on besides myself.
I prefer calling it lyrical.
Yeah, excellent. You see, that's why he's my friend. So, we're going to start over here with the first piece of music, and it's the Rachmaninoff Elegiac Trio. Before we get to the actual music, let me show you a little map here. And this is Tsarist Russia, as you can see, from 1855 to 1917. Now, the Rachmaninoff Elegiac Trio actually dates from 1892, and what's important for us to understand is that Russia was a gigantic empire. If you can see everything that's in sort of pale pastels there, not the green, but everything that's sort of whitish color, that was the Russian Empire, which spanned something like 9 time zones. Certainly in the late 19th century, couldn't very well jump on Aeroflot and take an A360, from one place to another. So to travel, I would say, west to east, which is practically Kamchatka, is all the way over by Japan, would probably take 3 to 4 weeks. And most people who did that journey died. So it was not the kind of thing. And why am I telling you this? Well, elegiac an elegy is kind of like a testament to something that is very somber. But Rachmaninoff was very young when he wrote this trio. And it was very common, actually. I would say Tchaikovsky probably is the one that sort of took elegies and made them common. What could you say to us about elegies and what it really does in this program?
Oh, yes, so as we were saying earlier, I use the word lyrical. I think a lot of the lines that you're going to hear, the melodic lines and the pulling of the tension, comes from these very dark harmonies and beautiful lyrical lines. And so an elegy is a piece of music that is a remembrance of somebody who's passed away. The one that always comes to mind for me is Bela Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra. He has an elegy movement there for the wife of Serge Koussevitzky, who had passed away.
Yeah, you can see in the slide that Rachmaninoff was a very noble 18-year-old, and here I think he's a little bit older, but he was in fact 18 when he wrote this. And he wrote 2 elegiac trios. The other one is 50 minutes long. So shockingly, we decided that a 50-minute Tchaikovsky and a 50-minute Rachmaninoff was probably not going to make it into this program. But let's listen to that first example where you have the entrance of the cello theme, and you'll see that Rachmaninoff, the virtuoso pianist, also knows how to give great melodic themes to the strings. Number 1, please. Yeah, so that example is actually Arensky. So we really should probably, there is an issue with our order. So let's just finish talking about the Rachmaninoff. And essentially this is a one-piece work. So what we want to do is we really want to talk about the second entrance of the piano, where the strings have a unison melody, and then basically there's a support there, compositionally speaking, really almost like a foundation, wouldn't you say? Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things where the strings here support. Let's go with number 2, please. Should have checked it. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, we have some issues there with the order of it, but let's just go to. I think we should talk about the Arensky a little bit more. The Rachmaninoff is such a short piece, but Anton Arensky is someone who really was a student of Tchaikovsky, and we have Rachmaninoff here. He was a very interesting individual, and what I'd like to talk to you about is what his teacher, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, said about his work. Now, it's curious that what we were looking at when we were studying this is that Arensky is actually a very famous composer in the chamber music repertoire. And yet his least supportive person somehow said that he would be forgotten quickly. So it's curious to us because, Arensky has now died, over 100 years ago, and yet his music is very much valued, and his teacher at the time was not someone who really did that. Is that something that happens in academia? Can you talk to us about that, about talented students who somehow their teachers don't appreciate?
I've had experiences of my own. When I was a graduate student at Indiana University, I would just bow down to my teacher, and whatever he said went. So if I brought something in and he said, I don't like it, I'd tear it up.
Yeah, exactly. But I think in a way, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov did, in fact, value him because he did help premiere a lot of his symphonies. And remember that back in the day, how do you get, as a composer, how do you get your music published? You have to have someone who's greater than you recommended. For example, Brahms did it for Dvorak. And certainly Tchaikovsky, Nikolai Rubinstein, we'll talk about in a moment. Rubinstein was someone who helped Tchaikovsky get published. So these kinds of things are very important. Can we look at number 3? And it's a very rollicking, I would say a very expressive kind of music. And it's also has some rhythmic vitality, which is quite different. Number 3, please. Yeah, so this is a stroke, actually. I would like you to see it when we play the Arensky. This scherzo is very Mendelssohnian. The stroke is called ricochet. Now, it's very interesting. Most of our terms are not French. They're very much Italian. But this, I think, has to do with the kind of bow we now use. And the kind of bow we now use is the great French makers were developing, which is why the bouncy stroke that's very close to the string and very close to the fingerboard is called ricochet. So let's go to the next example, which is the coda excerpt of the Arensky, and it's lyrical and exuberant and really hard on your sleeve. Number 4, please. Yeah, so this is actually, when we were rehearsing, we had to notice the exact quote from the Saint-Saëns Second Piano Concerto.
Oh, really? That's
it was
interesting.
unbelievable. And this slide is one of the reasons that I'm using it, is because the cello became, in the 1880s, very much of a solo instrument. Here you can see how prominent it is. Karl Davidov, to whom part of this is dedicated, also is the person who made that cello on your left, our left, your right, Jacqueline Dupre. That is a Stradivarius that he played, and it is now known as the Davidoff Strad. And in fact, you've heard the Davidoff Strad because for I'd say for one of the decades of Lynn Harrell's life, he owned the Davidoff Strad, and it was played in Dallas and Fort Worth. And so it's a really cool thing in this Arensky trio. Let's take a look at number 5, which is a sparkling scherzo, please.
It's not the scherzo. Which one is that? Oh, God.
So, fortunately,
that wasn't sparkling.
That was not sparkling. That was actually the elegy, and it seems like we have an order issue here. But more importantly, it was a great way for you to hear the Davidoff Strad cello, because this recording I was able to find is Jacqueline Dupre playing that cello. So it's a very cool thing. When you compose still, Do you often think of the timbre of the instrument, or is the composition itself first and foremost in your mind?
Oh no, the timbre of the instrument is really important. It's interesting, I'm teaching an instrumentation class right now at TCU, and we're talking about how when you're writing for instruments, you don't just want to know what are the low notes and the high notes, you have to know how does it sound in every register and with every kind of bow stroke, and so the timbre is extremely important. That's the way that you can express the non-musical elements in music.
Yeah, and I think that for somebody like Arensky, who at the time that he composed this, you know, he was not known as a great composer. Probably was wonderful for him to meet someone like Davidoff, who could help him with the instrument, explain what was relatively new at the time. I mean, in a way, this is the decade that Dvorak wrote his very famous cello concerto, and you know, you really didn't have virtuoso cellists, I should say. You had David Popper, and before him Boccherini, of course, but really the cello was not a foremost instrument in the repertoire. So this is quite new for Arensky, and I think it's really exciting to hear that instrument in this snippet. Let's look at number 8. I'm not sure what it is, but let's hear it, and I'll tell you about it in a minute. Yeah, so this is actually the finale of the Arensky, and in it, he actually does a wonderful job of reintroducing the themes from the first and second movement. Unlike the Rachmaninoff, this is a full 4-movement work, which is the way it was usually done. So the classical, if you wish, I should say really romantic pattern, right, is a fast first movement, maybe a scherzo in the second or third movement. In this case, it's the second movement. Then the elegy is slower, and then the scherzo is quicker. And then the last movement is sort of a virtuoso thing. But what he does here is reintroduce the themes from the first, second, and third movement, kind of like to put a little bow at the end of it. Is there a term for that?
Well, it depends on who the composer is and what the scope of the work is, but a lot of times when composers are bringing themes back in the last movement, what they're trying to do is create something like what's called an arch form, where the whole piece is like a cycle, and it's not just separate movements in a way, it's like separate moods, but with themes that come back. I always tell my students, it's like telling a musical story. You want to tie in those themes so that you feel like you're experiencing the storyline.
Absolutely, yeah. Or actually, something maybe closer to our time, when you see a film, like I always think about The Usual Suspects or Memento. You see a film that starts in the middle, but you don't realize it started in the middle, and then they fill in the spots afterwards. Right. So it's actually, I think in some ways it builds suspense without being suspenseful. Right. So it's really exciting. Yeah. All right, let's look at these pictures here, and why I'm telling you this is there's a grandeur to the imperial court that really rivaled, I would say, the Louvre and the French court, and that all started with Peter the Great. So if you look at some of these scenes, this is where the peasants lived, and this is where the Tsar lived. So in some ways, our music today depicts both. And certainly the Tchaikovsky was really something that was spectacularly interesting. So this, for example, would be obviously one of the noble balls, and you can see the dresses are incredible, and people prepared for it for many, many years. And this is Winter Palace, which was the residence of the Tsars and the Tsarinas. So Tchaikovsky, of course, was very much privy to this, because very early in his life he did in fact get recognized. Though he suffered from depression, as most of you know, and it was very difficult for him to actually accept success. Many of Tchaikovsky's works were panned. The First Symphony was panned. Certainly the Violin Concerto, everybody knows about. It wouldn't even be premiered by a person who was dedicated to Leopold Auer. So even though this was like a Fabergé egg, was something that he saw all the time, I think there was a lot of very insecure feelings in his work. And this trio wouldn't even have happened if he didn't have a bizarre relationship with a patron. Now, most of us think that patrons are the kind of people that go to concerts and talk to us and encourage us to write music, to recreate music in my case. But in this case, there was a lady who had 5 children, and she said, I will support you as long as we never meet. and I never want to see you. And I want to make sure that wherever you are, I'm not. So it was a very bizarre relationship, but she was a great letter writer. And she said to him in 1881, she said, would you be interested in writing a piano trio? Well, he said, I would be very interested in writing a piano trio, but not for the piano trio instruments, meaning that the piano would overwhelm the strings, and we don't think it works. In fact, I think that this is a terrible idea. So, nevertheless, he was smart enough to say, hey, you know, if Nadezhda von Meck, my patron, thinks we should do it, at least I should give it a try. And interestingly enough, it took him a little time, and he was in Rome, and he, in fact, did write sketches for it, and it took a couple of years, and it became actually one of his most eponymous works. So let's listen to number 9, and we'll kind of listen to what we're hearing in the very opening of the Tchaikovsky, please. So this is the opening of the Tchaikovsky Piano Trio, and the reason the slide is up in front of you is it's dedicated to Nikolai Rubinstein. No relation to Anton, actually his brother, but no relation to Arthur Rubinstein, the great pianist. Is a completely different thing. His relationship with Tchaikovsky was somewhat similar of Rimsky's relationship with Arensky, in that Nikolai Rubinstein panned his student. And they met only for a short time, but he had enough time to tell him how bad he was.
But it's interesting that he dedicated this piece to Rubinstein.
Exactly my point. So he forgave, Tchaikovsky forgave Rubinstein's indiscretion, if you will, and said, hey, even though he was not very nice to me, we sort of buried the hatchet for a while, and when Rubinstein passed away, he dedicated this trio to him, to a memory of a great artist, which I think says something about Tchaikovsky, too, because he recognized that Rubinstein, by the way, Rubinstein was a composer. You know this. Today, I cannot think of a single work, with all due respect, that we play by Nikolai Rubinstein. But in his time, he was very well respected. So Tchaikovsky said, look, you know, even though he hurt me, I forgive, and he dedicated this work because he understood how important it was. Let's look at example number 10. And this is more of a sunny part of the trio because it's not all doom and gloom. It is a dark thing, but there's a different contrast here because Tchaikovsky understood, even though this is a gigantic work, it does need a little bit of relief here and there. Number 10, please.
And if I could just say something about what we're hearing. So in the score is marked lugubre, which apparently means lugubrious, which also you might wonder, what does that mean? Kind of like sad and slow. And so the piece starts in A minor. And so A minor is here. But this area that we were just listening to comes a little bit after the beginning. And now he's moved to what we would consider to be a distant key. So here's the original key. That's a major 2, you might say, or technically a 5 of 5, to get very technical. My point is that this new key that we're in is very far away from the old key, and so there's something really sunny and warm and pleasant about it.
Exactly, and I really think it's important also to know that the basis of this tune is Russian folk songs. And many of the Russian folk songs, just like the Hungarian folk songs, the German, they're modal, so they don't really function in the rules of harmony as we understand Western harmony. And so here, you know, I find it interesting that somebody like Tchaikovsky, who spent the predominant part of his life in Russia, is writing something in Rome and his heart is still in Russia.
Yeah, that's a good
He could
point.
write something Italian,
Yeah.
but he didn't really do that. Let's look at number 11 here, and that is a piano solo. This movement is actually incredibly long, and the piece is really, you look at your programs, the piece is 44 minutes long, and it's in 2 movements, but because there's so many variations.
I mean, the form of this work is so different from what you would normally see in a chamber work, where you might have expected 4 movements, the same kinds of movements you explained earlier. But here we get one fairly long first movement, and then one very long second movement, which is all a theme and variations.
Yeah, and I think it has to do with the relationship and the things, the memories that Tchaikovsky had with Rubinstein. And remember, he did not have a great relationship. I can't see them going out to dinner. But, for example, in this theme, this is a very Russian theme, and that's what the Russians would recognize when they thought of Nikolai Rubinstein. Let's look at number 10, please. 11.
So as is typical with a theme and variations, you would expect the theme to be something simple, something that the audience can understand right away, and that's the jumping off point, so that the variations are something that you can kind of, it pulls you along.
It would probably be fair to say that theme and variations, I mean, is very much a Baroque way of doing things. If you look at a chaconne or a toccata, oftentimes you state a theme, well, any fugue actually, and there's a fugue in this one. You state the theme, and then you have a counter subject, and then they develop certain snippets of it. So I think Tchaikovsky was able to, in some ways, tip his hat to Rubinstein and say, look, I learned a lot from you.
Yeah.
It's one of the most incredible works because he states this tiny little theme, and as you'll hear in the next variation, number 12, this is a waltz, and who is better at waltzes? Except for maybe Johann Strauss Jr.
Oh yeah, my favorite.
But the best waltz writer in Russia is, of course, Tchaikovsky. Let's look at number 12, please.
So that's obviously in a 3 meter, it's like a waltz, very much. And I also wanted to bring up one other thing that I always find when I'm listening to music, when I'm in the audience listening, I'm really not just thinking about the form or the timbre, but I'm thinking about the interplay between the different instruments. So for instance, in that movement, you hear that the cello was really the primary melodic instrument, and then the violin picked it up. And I always find it really fascinating to think from movement to movement, who's the primary instrument, what's the conversation like between them, and at other times they both join in together and maybe play in octaves, which is a very strong kind of sound.
Yeah, it's a great point. I do want to mention one thing. This slide is here for a reason. This is a very large concert hall, and Tchaikovsky. This is a great hall of the Moscow Conservatory. So Tchaikovsky played here, and if you look at the pictures of the people on the wall, I mean, these were the composers of their time, except for maybe Bach. So you really, this is no longer Beethoven's, let's say, the Ghost Trio, which you've heard here in past seasons. This is a giant hall. I believe it seats about 2,400 people. And Tchaikovsky planned this trio to be performed here. Chamber music, while performed in palaces and smaller homes, was still going to be performed here. So we're now in what I would call a more modern setting for chamber music. And this, to me, actually is one of the most magical things that he ever composed, because this is everything he learned from all of the ballets, from all of the symphonies, how to write for the strings, how, if you think of Nutcracker, if you think of the, Swan Lake, for example, the great solos for the cello and the violin, he started writing that when he was about 20 years old, but many of them, I take my word for it, are incredibly awkward and poorly written for the instrument, but it got better. And this, as is one of his last works, is maybe the very best writing for the instruments. Let's look at the next example. This is exactly the opposite. This is much more of a somber, difficult, actually hard to tell what the rhythm is here. Let's look at number 13, please.
Yeah, of course, this is a very melancholic sound. We're back to that remembrance and the sadness of having lost somebody. And I also was looking in the score and noticing that the indication in the score was andante flebile ma non tonto, and I thought, okay, I don't speak Italian well, but I don't know what flebile means. I looked it up. It just means weak, like a weak andante.
I don't think that's what he meant. I think what he's saying to you is he's saying this is hopeless. It's tired. You know, if you're looking at, well, we talked about the Arensky. Remember that section that we talked about, the Saint-Saëns piano concerto? Yeah. Here it is again. I mean, this is Carnival of the Animals, straight out of there. Right. So I think he's basically saying, you know, if we have an elegiac trio, there are areas here of complete despair, and this is one of them. And what we're trying to do here is to say that, look, time has just stopped, and we're not so interested in what's next. We want you to be in the moment. And the piano here just is water. It's really quite an incredible moment. And by the way, rhythmically speaking, very difficult to execute because the way he writes it in 9/8, where do you place da-da-dam, da-da-dam? Because it's almost spoken, isn't it? Yeah. So let's look at the finale, which is also gigantic and has a small little fugal interplay in it, and it's much more happy. But I'll tell you, it doesn't quite end that way. Let's look at number 14. So you can see that this is the very opening of the trio, but with everything you've got. Is this something that you feel like connects in some ways with the Arensky when he sort of recaps his first two movements?
Oh, that's a very good point. Yes, I mean, it really is one of those romanticized, romantic, formal ideas. You know, bring the theme back, but we've traveled so far, especially in this piece, we've traveled for 40 minutes, and now we want to know what's the message, and this is the message here. And again, he puts it in octaves. He has the strings in octaves. It's very strong. It's like this mournful cry, you know.
Indeed. Well, the time of this, I think about somebody like Richard Strauss, who actually lived well into the 20th century, but he wrote a hero's life, which is autobiographical. So I think in some ways here, we'll never know whether the biography is really his experiences with Nikolai Rubinstein, or him looking back on his own life and saying, hey, you know, went to these parties, wrote some really good music, you guys didn't like it, and then so on and so forth. So we'll never know, but the point is that the impact of this trio is symphonic in nature. And I think that what you'll hear today is the elegiac trio of an 18-year-old Rachmaninoff, this sort of inner Russian, although much more Mendelssohnian feel of the Arensky, and then all of the above times two with Tchaikovsky, where he demonstrates all of his skill and the relationship he's had with many of the Russians while writing it in Rome, which I was just there in December. I can tell you it's never been better. So I hope you enjoyed this afternoon concert. Thank you so much coming for this. And sorry about a couple of our glitches, but we really look forward to performing for you this afternoon. Thank you so much.